Hi, welcome to this short video. This video is a reading preview of the text Letter to My Son. This was originally published in The Atlantic, which is a great newspaper. You can read articles online for free, lots of great articles there. This is probably one of the most complicated and dense pieces of writing that we're going to be reading for this class. So I want to start with a little bit of advice. When you are reading something that is really complicated, you want to plan on reading it more than one time. So this is true for philosophy classes too. Anytime you're reading anything dense with beautiful language, maybe something that's old, you can read it a few times with different goals each time. The first time you might read it just to get the general understanding, and then you might read it again to get more detail and really understand some of the nuances of the argument. And then my second piece of reading advice is really try to understand the context for the writing. When it was written, what was going on when it was written, things that the author references, that's really going to help the text make more sense for you. So one of the things you can think about when you're thinking about context is what's the author's purpose, goal for this? Do you know the intended audience? And what do you know about the author's background? So you might actually do a little bit of research before jumping into something that's complicated. So what do we know about this piece? It was published in The Atlantic, and it was published in the July 4th issue in 2015, and this issue was all about race relations in the United States. So that's a little bit of context that will really help us. That's a picture of the author and his son. We could also go ahead and look up a little bit about the author. A lot of the texts that we read for this class are by living authors, so the best place to go is the author's own official website. If you go to their official website, you get to see how they frame themselves, how they introduce themselves, how they like to describe their work, which is a little different than what Wikipedia might say. So we can just go ahead and go to Ta-Nehisi Coates' official website. And when we do that, we'll read his biography. We'll see that he's a journalist by trade. So then when we're reading the text, we can see the influence of journalism. We can see the investigative reporting. We can see the focus on history. We also will see that he is the author of best-selling books and that he's won some major awards. So that really gives us a little bit of context for him. And then we want to look for anything really important about the time that this was written. So looking for reference to important cultural events. This is especially useful for international students. So this is about race relations in the United States. If you are a student who's not from the United States, you might have to do a little bit of Googling around to understand some of the key events that he's referencing. So it talks about the killers of Michael Brown going free. It talks about a lot of racial violence, a lot of incidents where police officers have killed young African American men. So if you don't know about that, you might just Google, when was Michael Brown shot? And then you'll read that he was an 18-year-old African American and that he was shot by a white police officer. So that's useful context, and you might want to do that when you're reading. As you come across something that seems really important that you don't have any background for, you could always just use Google as a great resource. So one of the things you're going to see is a lot of references of deaths of African Americans. So that's something that you'll notice. You wouldn't have to look up each of those, but it might give you some useful context. And then you'll see that the police departments have been endowed with the authority to destroy your body. So that's something to keep in mind too. It's a kind of a central idea that this text explores. And then another thing you want to do is think about what kind of piece of writing is this? What genre is it? We know that it was published in The Atlantic, but this particular piece is called Letter to My Son, and it's written in the genre of somebody writing a letter to a loved one that a wider audience gets to read. Even though it's not written to us, it's written specifically to his son, we can kind of take a look at that genre. What would we expect from a letter from a father to his son? How does that influence the way we react to it? And then you're going to think about evidence. How does the author use evidence? Do they use a lot of statistics? Do they use personal stories? Do they use facts? What's the main source of evidence? So we're going to go ahead and look at the opening of this. And as we're looking at this, we're going to be thinking about the tone and the genre. And we're going to be thinking about, going back to rhetoric, all the choices that Ta-Nehisi Coates had when he wrote this piece for The Atlantic. He chose to frame it as a letter to his son. So why might he have made that decision? And how does that influence the way that we react to it as an audience member? So this text was originally published on The Atlantic. I've also made a PDF and put it up on our Canvas site. I added in brackets paragraph numbers. These weren't part of the original text, but you can go ahead and look at those to kind of keep track of where we are in the text. This is going to be helpful for when you quote from the text later. So you're going to be reading this on your own more than once, but what I'm going to do is read just a bit of it, the first 4 paragraphs, and then we're going to think about the tone. So pay attention to the fact that it's framed as a letter and pay attention to the tone. Son, last Sunday the host of a popular news show asked me what it meant to lose my body. The host was broadcasting from Washington, D.C., and I was seated in a remote studio on the far west side of Manhattan. A satellite closed the miles between us, but no machinery could close the gap between her world and the world from which I had been summoned to speak. When the host asked me about my body, her face faded from the screen and was replaced by a scroll of words written by me earlier that week. The host read these words for the audience, and when she finished, she turned to the subject of my body, although she did not mention it specifically. But by now, I am accustomed to intelligent people asking about the condition of my body without realizing the nature of their request. Specifically, the host wished to know why I felt that white America's progress, or rather the progress of those Americans who believe that they are white, was built on looting and violence. Hearing this, I felt an old and indistinct sadness well up in me. The answer to this question is a record of the believers themselves. The answer is American history. There is nothing extreme in this statement. Americans deify democracy in a way that allows for a dim awareness that they have, from time to time, stood in defiance of their God. This defiance is not much to be dwelled upon. Democracy is a forgiving God, and Americans' heresies, torture, theft, enslavement, are specimens of sin, so common among individuals and nations that none can declare themselves immune. In fact, Americans, in a real sense, have never betrayed their God. When Abraham Lincoln declared, in 1863, that the Battle of Gettysburg must ensure that the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth, he was not merely being aspirational. At the onset of the Civil War, the United States of America had one of the highest rates of suffrage in the world. The question is not whether Lincoln truly meant government of the people, but what our country has, throughout its history, taken the political term people to actually mean. In 1863, it did not mean your mother or your grandmother, and it did not mean you and me. As for now, it must be said that the elevation of the belief in being white was not achieved through wine tastings and ice cream socials, but rather through the pillaging of life, liberty, labor, and land. That Saturday, on that news show, I tried to explain this as best as I could within the time allotted. But at the end of this segment, the host flashed a widely shared picture of a 12-year-old boy tearfully hugging a white police officer. Then she asked me about hope. And I knew then that I had failed, and I remembered that I had expected to fail, and I wondered again at the indistinct sadness welling up in me. Why exactly was I sad? I came out of the studio and walked for a while. It was a calm, late November day. Families, believing themselves white, were out on the streets. Infants, raised to be white, were bundled in strollers, and I was sad for these people, much as I was sad for the host, and sad for all the people out there watching and reveling in a specious hope. I realized why I was sad. When the journalist asked me about my body, it was like she was asking me to awaken her from the most gorgeous dream. I have seen that dream all my life. It is perfect houses with nice lawns. It is Memorial Day cookouts, block associations, and driveways. The dream is tree houses and the Cub Scouts. And for so long, I've wanted to escape into that dream, to fold my country over my head like a blanket. But this has never been an option, because the dream rests on our backs, the bedding made from our bodies. And knowing this, knowing that the dream persists by warring with the known world, I was sad for the host. I was sad for all those families. I was sad for my country. But above all, in that moment, I was sad for you. That was the week you learned that the killers of Michael Brown would go free. The men who had left his body in the street would never be punished. It was not my expectation that anyone would ever be punished. But you were young and still believed. You stayed up until 11 p.m. that night, waiting for the announcement of an indictment. And when instead it was announced that there was none, you said, "I've got to go," and you went into your room, and I heard you crying. I came in 5 minutes after, and I didn't hug you, and I didn't comfort you, because I thought it would be wrong to comfort you. I did not tell you that it would be okay, because I have never believed it would be okay. What I told you is what your grandparents tried to tell me, that this is your country, that this is your world, that this is your body, and you must find some way to live within all of it. I write you in your 15th year. So we'll just stop there. And now that you've had a chance to get a sense of the tone and the genre that he's writing this to his son, but his son is 15 at the time, I want you to think about how framing it as a letter influenced the way you reacted to it. How might you have reacted to it differently if it had been a strictly journalistic piece, instead of it being a piece where you're kind of eavesdropping on a father talking to his son and thinking through how he wants to describe the world to his son? So what we're going to do now, it's a question for you to think about. Okay, so what you want to think about was, in the fact that it's framed as a letter, is there anything that was surprising to you about the way that he writes to his son, his level of honesty, his way of looking at the world? And how does framing this as a letter really influence the way you react to it? So you consider quotes where he's speaking to his son that we're eavesdropping on. So things like, "I did not tell you it would be okay because I never believed that it would be okay." How do you react to that as an audience member? How does thinking about a father having to have these kind of conversations with the son influence you versus it being a strictly journalistic piece? And then the other thing that you're going to be doing, starting with any difficult text, is really doing active reading as you're reading it. So I think we've all had that experience where you're reading something and your mind wanders, and 3 minutes later you realize you haven't paid attention for 2 pages and you have to go all the way back and start over. So what you want to think about doing is, as you're reading, to keep yourself focused and engaged, start to actually write on the text. So what I recommend is print it out or annotate it on your screen in some way. So you might underline things, you might highlight things, you might write questions in the margins, you might write ideas that you have, reactions that you have to a text. And this is a great way to stay focused and to make sure that you're getting the most out of a text. So here's an example. This is the first page PDF, and I printed it out, and these are some of my annotations. So I wrote that his son's 15 years old. I wrote that Coates grew up in Baltimore in the 1980s. So things I just kind of want to keep track of that give me a framework. I wrote some questions on the margins here. Why does he view his interview as a failure? What does he mean by the phrase "people who believe they are white"? Why does he not just say "white people"? So why is he making that choice? And then, I highlighted keywords that are repeated. So what I want you to do as you're reading this text is also highlight keywords that are repeated. What I want you to focus on is hope versus struggle. So you might highlight all the instances of hope, all the instances of struggle, and think about this question. Why does he value struggle? Why does he take issue with hope? So he sets them up as opposed to each other, and I want you to be analyzing what does he think the problem is with hope? And why does he think struggle is beautiful, worthwhile, important? And then the other big question, the other thing you should annotate for, is the dream. The American dream, or just the phrase dream or the dream, is repeated very often in this text. So I'd recommend circling those, highlighting those, and keep a running definition going. So I wanted to also show the image that I mentioned in paragraph 4. So Coates writes at the end of his interview, the host flashed a widely shared picture of a 12-year-old boy tearfully hugging a white police officer. This is that picture. So it was circulating. It happened at a protest after the Ferguson shooting. So there's that image. And when the host shows this image, Coates writes that he felt that the interview was a failure. He says, "I knew then that I had failed, and I remembered that I had expected to fail." So what I want you to think about is hope. Why we want to have hope about race relations as members of the audience, and why does Coates view this host question as showing that he failed in the interview? So when you're analyzing this, you might think back about his message and his goals. So what is his goal? What does he want people to think, believe, feel, and understand by reading this text? And then when the host asks about hope, how does that show that he didn't reach his goal? So this is really connected back to his message and his goals, the reaction he's trying to get from the audience, the type of conversation he wants to have, the content of the reading. So go ahead and do the active journaling and the next few assignments.